Welcome to this trip through one of the scariest cases in U.S. history. A young woman named Florence Whitaker had a terrible accident in the Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina in 1899. Today, we'll go there with you. Just let us know where you are by leaving a comment before we start. Let's work together to solve this puzzle, one that hasn't been answered in more than 100 years. In 1899, an era came to an end. NC was in between the Old World and the New World. The New. Some main streets in coastal towns were getting electricity, but in the Appalachians mountain towns where people lived alone, life went back to the way it was done by their ancestors. There, families lived in wooden cabins spread out over miles of dense forest and dangerous trails, between misty peaks and deep valleys where the sun never reached the ground in the winter. Florence Whitaker's story began when she was only 19 years old. She lived on a farm with her family, a simple home in Watauga County, which is in the mountains and has harsh winters and complete isolation. People knew how beautiful the young woman was. Long brown hair and light eyes stood out against the pale skin that most people at that elevation have. Florence was the daughter of farmers and helped with daily chores and took care of her younger siblings. According to accounts from the time found in county archives, she liked to walk alone in the woods, which worried her parents a lot. Her mom. There was a natural labyrinth in that area made by the Appalachian Mountains. They covered dozens of square miles of dense forest with no one has been able to find yet. There were also paths that got lost in the trees. People in the area knew old stories about people who went into those forests and never came back. It wasn't just a story. At least 7 people have gone missing in Watauga County without being found in the last 20 years, according to official records. But nothing could have prepared the area for what was about to happen. Florence began to act strangely in the fall. Later, when she was 13, her younger sister Martha told the local newspaper that Florence would stare out the cabin window at the mountains for hours on end. She said that at night she could hear people calling her name. At first, the family thought that this behavior was caused by the loneliness and sadness that come with the shorter days and colder weather. But there was more going on than that. On October 17, 1899, Florence quickly left home after breakfast. Her mother was told she was going to visit her next-door neighbors, the Cooper family, who lived about 2 miles away. She had been on that walk 100 times. The path was pretty safe because it was marked with white stones that locals had put down years before. Florence brought Mrs. Cooper, who was getting better from being sick, a basket of bread and jams. She wore a dark wool shawl, a simple gray dress, and worn-out leather boots. The last time her dad saw her leave, around 8 in the morning. It was never Florence who got to the Cooper house. When the sun went down and she didn't come back, her father got some other men in the area to help search for her. Along the path, they held kerosene lanterns and called her name through the trees. They could hear each other over the mountain in the cold October wind, but no one answered. The basket she was carrying was found not far from her home on the trail. The things inside were still there, but Florence's shawl was missing. There were not any hints of a fight. There were no tracks that got in the way. It looked like she had just disappeared. More than 40 men searched the mountains for 3 days. They split up into groups and went exploring in ravines, known caves, and along every creek. At night, the temperature dropped quickly and got very close to freezing. Every hour that went by would make it less likely for Florence to stay alive if she got lost in the forest. But then something even scarier started to show up. When people in neighboring areas learned of, after she went missing, started sharing disturbing stories. 3 of them said they saw Florence walking toward the higher mountains, away from the trail to the Cooper house, and toward a place called Hollow Creek in the area. Even the most skilled hunters knew not to go to Hollow Creek. A narrow, deep valley with dark rock cliffs on all sides. A cold stream ran over stones covered in moss. This place had more plants than that one. Sunlight didn't get through very often, and there was something unsettling about the atmosphere. Old people said that Hollow Creek was a cursed place where weird things happened. The area was avoided by animals. There were no birds singing, and no one built a house nearby. Search teams were hesitant as they approached Hollow Creek. Even the bravest men felt uneasy when they went into the valley for no clear reason. The sound of water running over rocks was the only thing that broke the silence. During the 4th day of searching, one of the trackers came across something that would change the whole investigation. Caught on a low branch about 100 yards away, Florence's shawl could be seen from the base of the valley. One end of the dark wool shirt was torn, like it had been ripped off with force. The discovery brought a mixture of hope and terror. In one way, it proved that Florence had been there. At the same time, it brought up some troubling questions. How come she got so lost on the way to the Cooper house? Why did she go to Hollow Creek, a place she knew was dangerous? The men increased their search in that area, but the rough terrain made every step difficult. Hard work. The ravines opened up out of the blue. Falls from loose rocks could kill you, and the plants were so thick that you could walk right up to something and not see it. As the search went on, people started to gather at the small wooden church that served Watauga County. The prayers were led by Reverend Thomas Blackwood, a 52-year-old man who knew every family in the area. But there were also whispered conversations about things people had seen but were afraid to say out loud. Talk about openly. A store owner in the nearby village said Florence bought a lot of candles 2 weeks before she went missing. A young farmer said he saw her walking alone toward the mountains at dusk with something wrapped in cloth. The younger sister of Florence, Martha, finally told everyone something she had been keeping secret. Florence was sitting on the edge of her bed the night before she went missing. The only light coming in through the window was from the moon. She was writing something in a small notebook, and she was moving quickly and tensely. When Martha asked Florence what she was doing, she quickly put the notebook away and said it was just for her own thoughts and nothing important. Martha went back to sleep. When Florence left for her dangerous walk in the morning, the notebook was nowhere to be found. It looks like she took it with her. Florence's parents were so upset about her death that they let police search her room for clues. What they found there made the case even more mysterious. Under the bed, hidden between the wooden floorboards, were several old newspaper clippings. All of them were about people who have gone missing in the Appalachians over the last 30 years. The dates were circled, names were underlined, and notes were written in the margins. It looked like he was looking into something on his own, putting together cases that didn't seem to go together. One of the news stories stood out. It came from a newspaper from 1867, which is more than 130 years ago. The report said that a 21-year-old woman named Elizabeth Thorne had gone missing in the very same mountains. The case was never solved. But what researchers didn't understand was a note Florence wrote in the yellowed paper's margin. Hollow Creek, the same age, the same time of year. How did Florence know all of this? The newspaper didn't talk about Hollow Creek by name. Also, how could a young woman who lives alone in the mountains get her hands on such old newspapers? The search has been going on for 2 weeks now. Things were getting worse outside. The highest peaks got their first snowfall of the season. The Whitaker family was on the edge of losing their mind. The dad didn't get much sleep because every morning he went out with smaller and smaller groups of volunteers. As time went on, more and more people thought Florence had either fallen into a deep gorge or died from the cold. But some people, especially the older ones, had darker ideas. They talked about old ceremonies of people who were called by the mountains and of forces that lived in these areas before Europeans came. Then something happened that took the investigation in a whole new direction. A A lumberjack named Jacob Miller came to town with a scary story. He worked in a remote area about 5 miles from Hollow Creek. 3 nights before, he saw a strange light in the mountains on his way back to his remote cabin after a long day's work. It wasn't a flashlight or firelight. It was a blue glow that moved through the trees. Jacob, who is naturally cautious and practical, chose to look into it. He slowly walked up, carrying his axe. Jacob could hear things as he got closer. Something that made him stop. It was singing. He heard chanting from several women in a language he didn't know. The sound came from a clearing that was hidden by tall rocks. He hid behind a big tree and watched. The bluish light came from something in the middle of the clearing, but he couldn't see it because of the plants. He could see moving shapes that looked like people in a circle. The light then got brighter for a moment, and Jacob was sure he saw a young woman with long hair. Hair and a dark dress in the middle of the circle. Even though he couldn't see her face, the silhouette he saw was a perfect match for Florence Whitaker. Jacob stood still and watched for a while. Then he jerked back. One of the figures turned toward him as if they could feel him there. Jacob saw what he wanted to see right away. He hurried back to his cabin, locked the door, and couldn't sleep all night. He was afraid of being laughed at, or worse, for 3 days before he had the guts to tell what he had seen. Accusations of having something to do with the disappearance. The word about Jacob Miller's story spread like wildfire in the neighborhood. He was called crazy by some, and a drunk visionary by others. But there was one thing that everyone couldn't miss. Jacob gave a good description of where the clearing was. He drew a simple map that showed specific trees, rock formations, and how far away they were from well-known landmarks. William Thornton, the 47-year-old sheriff of the area, thought it was important to look into it. He put together a group of 12 men, all armed, left early the next morning. It took almost 5 hours to walk to the clearing that Jacob had talked about. Roots and loose rocks were hidden by a thin layer of fresh snow, making the ground dangerous. Once they got there, they were shocked to see something they hadn't seen before. The clearing looked just like Jacob had said it would. It looked like something very heavy had been dragged in circles across the ground in the middle, leaving marks that were perfect circles, the area around. Some plants were burned, but not by a normal fire. Instead, they looked like they had been exposed to intense heat that burned them without starting flames. Officer Thornton had faith, but he also knew what was right. He was looking for explanations that made sense. The Cherokee tribes that lived in the area had been forced to leave decades before the Trail of Tears, so it's possible that the marks were from an old Native American ceremony. Or maybe it had something to do with settler habits he didn't know about. But there was one thing that really bothered him. In the exact middle of the circles, buried in the frozen ground, was a metal object that looked like an oval medallion, but was worn down by time and had symbols on it that no one could read. The men picked up the medallion with care. It was heavy and looked like it was made of bronze or old copper. The engraved symbols were complicated and geometric, and they didn't match any alphabet that the people there knew of. They didn't look like letters in English, Latin, or Greek. One of the men who had served in. People in the army and across the country thought they might be signs of a secret society or esoteric fraternity. In the early 1900s, these kinds of groups were common, especially in remote areas where the law and the church didn't have much power. But where did Florence go? That day, the clearing didn't show anything else. There was no sign of her clothes or personal items, and there was no sign that she was there. Anything could have been seen by Jacob. The bluish light he talked about could be caused by natural events, though not often. Strange luminescences were sometimes caused by gases deep inside the earth, or they could be the moon reflecting off of ice crystals. In the mountains, the wind made sounds that were hard to believe, even for people who know what they're hearing. He showed the medallion to Reverend Blackwood when he got back to the settlement. The priest looked at the object with growing unease. He said that the symbols looked a lot like marks he had seen in old books about European witchcraft. Rituals that were thought to have been brought by early settlers and were kept secret for many years. The Reverend was careful, though. I didn't want to spread fear or superstition. He said that the medallion should be sent to an Eastern university so that experts could properly study it. At the same time, the search for Florence went on, but resources were running out quickly. Winter had come back stronger than ever. The trails were covered in snow. Very little heat was felt at night. If Florence was still alive in those mountain ranges, she had almost no chance of staying alive. The Whitaker family began getting ready for the worst. Florence's mom would sit by the window and look out at the mountains all day, hoping for a miracle that would happen but never did. Something very strange happened on the 33rd day after the person went missing. Sarah Hriss came to town with a story that would amaze everyone. She lived on a farm in the farthest corner of Watauga County, about 15 miles from the Whitaker property. Sarah had been living by herself since. 2 winters ago, her husband died of pneumonia. She didn't go down to town very often because she liked being alone on her land. But on that cold November morning, she rode for hours to get back information that she couldn't keep to herself. Sarah told the story of the time she woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of someone knocking on her door 4 nights before. It was a faint, almost hesitant knock. She was scared, so she took the shotgun that belonged to her dead husband and walked up to the door. She looked around and asked who was there. A weak, a shaking woman's voice answered, asking for help. Sarah was shocked when she opened the door just a little. A young woman was lying on her porch steps in torn, dirty clothes. Her feet were bare and bloody, and her face was scratched and dirty. She was barely awake and mumbling words that no one could understand. Sarah took her inside, put blankets over her, and tried to keep her warm by the fireplace. She cleaned her wounds, boiled water, and made hot tea. The young woman went in and out of consciousness, opening her eyes now and then, but not seeming to know what was going on, of where she was. Sarah realized she was very cold and not getting enough food. Taking care of her as best she could for 3 days, she fed her hot broth, kept her warm, and used home remedies to heal her wounds. The young woman got better over time, but she didn't say a word, as if she were in a deep shock. The young woman finally spoke clearly in the morning of the 4th day. She told them her name was Florence Whitaker. Sarah almost didn't believe it. She had heard that someone had gone missing. Of course, but her farm was so far away from the case that she never thought it could have anything to do with it. She quickly got on her horse and rode into the village to tell everyone what had happened. No one knew yet how badly Florence was hurt, but she was still alive. Sheriff Thornton rode right away to Sarah Hrick's farm with Dr. Edmund Hayes, Florence's parents, and Florence herself. The 15-mile trip through the snowy mountains took almost 6 hours. It was late afternoon when they finally got there. Florence's mom rushed in. As she walked into the cabin and up to her daughter, who was sitting by the fireplace wrapped in thick blankets, her hands were shaking as she spoke to her. Florence looked nothing like herself. Her face was scarred with deep scratches that were just starting to heal. It used to be young and beautiful. It looked like chunks of her long brown hair had been ripped out because they were tangled and dirty. Her eyes used to be bright, but now they looked like they were staring into space. At first, Florence didn't do anything when her mother hugged her. She stood still as if she didn't know what a person was. Talk to. The soft crying didn't start for a few minutes. It was a cry that seemed to come from a very deep place. Dr. Hayes carefully checked out Florence. She was severely dehydrated and had lost considerable weight. Her feet were in terrible shape. They were cut all over, and some of the cuts were already infected. Her arms and legs were bruised, which meant she had probably fallen or stumbled many times in the thick forest. but there were no signs of direct violence. There was no proof of assault. The doctor decided that she had made it. In the harsh winter weather, being alone in the mountains for more than a month is almost impossible. Sheriff Thornton was very patient as he waited for Florence to calm down. From there, he asked questions in a soft voice. He had to figure out what had happened. Where had she been the whole time? How did she stay alive? How did she get to Sarah's farm when she was so far from any known path? Florence looked at him with those sad eyes and spoke. As if she hadn't said anything, her voice was like a hoarse whisper. Heard her voice in weeks. She remembered taking the basket for Mrs. Cooper when she left home that October morning. She remembered walking on the path she knew well. After that, something took place. Someone was calling her name. It wasn't a voice from outside, but from inside her own head. She couldn't resist the urge that pulled her off the trail. She put down the basket and started to walk up the higher mountains, but she couldn't control her steps. It was like she couldn't stop watching herself from afar. Florence said she lost track of time as she walked for hours or even days. The forest looked strange and off. There seemed to be more trees and less sky. She got to Hollow Creek, but she didn't know how. That's where she met a group of people. She had trouble seeing their faces. There was a strange haze over everything. They talked to her, but what they said didn't make sense. There were light shows, ceremonies, and circles on the ground. It seemed like her memory was a part of something she couldn't fully explain, had been erased in part. The days got fuzzier. She said she was sometimes in a cave and other times outside. She thought there were other people there. Figures in the dark came and went. Roots, tree bark, and melted snow were some of the things she ate in the forest. She hid herself with leaves and moss and slept in holes in the rocks. Like she was in a dream she couldn't wake up from. Her mind was swirling. She wasn't sure what was real and what was just a dream. Then one night there was a change. Florence woke up by herself, and some of the fog had lifted. The floor of the small cave she didn't know was cold where she was lying. The notebook she had brought with her was next to her. It was open to a certain page and had her handwriting on it, but she couldn't remember what she had written. The words didn't make sense. There were broken sentences, strange drawings, and symbols that looked a lot like the ones on the medallion that the sheriff had found. Florence got up and started to move with a strength she wasn't sure she had. Strolling. She had no idea where she was going. She was just acting on a basic instinct to stay alive. She walked for days, falling down and getting back up again and again. She ate snow and drank water from the icy streams. She kept going, even though her feet hurt. After she had lost all of her strength, she saw light off in the distance. It was the cabin of Sarah Hendrick. Before she passed out on that porch, that was the last thing she remembered. Sheriff Thornton did not say anything. He asked some very clear questions. How did Florence? Tell us how many people were in the group. Did she remember any faces or names? Were there men or only women? That was all Florence could do. She didn't remember anything. It was all fuzzy and broken up. It was like trying to remember a dream that goes away as soon as you wake up. There were times when she tried to remember things, but they just seemed to slip away. The notebook was asked about by Florence's dad. Where did it go? She said she dropped it somewhere while running through the woods to get away. She, not sure where. The sheriff knew that the notebook might have important information in it, but that it would be impossible to find in those huge mountains. You could not find a needle in a haystack that was the size of a county. Still, he said he would send out search parties as soon as the weather got better. Florence was taken back to her family home over the next few days. She had physical wounds that Dr. Hayes treated every day, but the mental wounds were deeper and took longer to heal. Mary Ann spent hours looking out the window at the mountains, just like she did before she went missing. She talked to herself in a low voice and used words that no one could fully understand. Her sister Martha didn't want to be in the room with Florence by herself because Florence would wake up in the middle of the night screaming and sweating because she thought shadows were chasing her. In the weeks after Florence got back, Reverend Blackwood went to see the Whitaker family more than once. He tried to give the girl spiritual comfort and pray with her, help her mind stop being so upset. But Florence did not respond normally to the prayers. She got antsy and tense, like the holy words were really bothering her. When the Reverend started to read a certain psalm one time, Florence put her hands over her ears and moaned, pleading with him to stop. Reverend Blackwood talked to the parents alone because he was worried. He said it was possible that Florence had been exposed to something in the mountains that had changed her spirit. He didn't talk about. According to the standards of the time, he was a smart and educated man, but he believed that some dark practices could leave deep scars on the human mind. He said that Florence should be prayed for all the time, and that her family should get help from mental health professionals, who don't work in that area but do in the bigger cities in the East. Sheriff Thornton, meanwhile, didn't stop looking into it. He planned a second trip to Hollow Creek, this time with more men, and more and better tools. They were trying to find the cave Florence had talked about, which is where she had woken up before she ran away. They brought hunting dogs with them in the hopes that they could find a trail, but the recent snowfall had covered everything. The trails were not possible. The operation had to be called off after 3 days of failed attempts and 2 men almost getting lost in the snow. They'd have to wait until spring. Between the winters of 1899 and 1900, Florence stayed at home and slowly got stronger, but she was very different now in a deep way. The happy, interested young woman she was before she went missing never came back. Instead of her, there was a quiet, distant person who was troubled by memories she couldn't fully explain. She stopped going for a walk in the woods. She didn't leave the house very often. When she did, she looked down and avoided the mountains. Martha watched her sister with fear and care at the same time. Researchers in the area would find her personal diary decades later and find entries about times when Florence, would be standing by the window, staring out into the dark, when she would wake up. In a very disturbing entry from January 1900, Martha wrote that when she woke up, Florence was drawing on the bedroom floor with charcoal from the fireplace. The symbols were the same as the ones on the medallion, circles inside circles, and geometric lines that made complicated patterns. Dr. Hayes became interested in the case and started to look into it in his own books and through letters with co-workers from other areas. He found something similar. We have news from several areas of the Appalachians. People, usually young women, would go missing for long periods of time and then come back in similar ways to Florence. They would always have fragmented memories, talk about voices calling them, and show big changes in their personalities. While the cases were rare and came years or even decades apart, they did follow a disturbing pattern. One case that was especially important was that of Elizabeth Thorne, the same young woman who was talked about in the newspaper clipping. Florence had saved money. Someone who used to work for Dr. Hayes and had treated the Thorne family was able to help him find the case's medical records. Elizabeth had not been seen since October 1867, exactly 32 years before Florence. She came back 6 weeks later in almost the same condition. Elizabeth only lived for 3 more years after her return, and she died at the age of 24 in a mysterious way. She was malnourished, hurt, and had trouble remembering rituals and voices. What Dr. Hayes learned was very scary. He told Sheriff Thornton and Florence's parents what he had found, but asked them to keep it quiet. They did not want to scare the neighbors or make Florence feel even more alone. But the question stayed, was there some kind of cycle going on in those mountains? Something that happened over and over again and picked certain people to kill for unknown reasons? If so, who or what did it. It was finally sent to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill with the medallion that was found in the hole. Hill. It took months for someone to answer. The information was both interesting and scary when it came in the form of a long letter from Arthur Peyton, a professor of ancient history. The symbols didn't come from a known civilization, but they looked a lot like marks found at very old archaeological sites in Europe before Christianity. These signs had to do with lunar cycles, fertility cults, and what some ancient cultures called gateways to other worlds. Professor Pemberton made guesses with. Scholars are wary of the idea that these practices may have been brought to the New World by groups of European settlers who then kept them secret for generations. Most of the time, these kinds of cults set up shop in remote areas, out of sight of both religious and civil authorities. Because they are so big and far away, the Appalachians would be the perfect place. The professor did warn, though, that all of this was just guesswork. It was impossible to prove any theory without more solid physical evidence. Spring, slowly. I made it to the mountains. When the snow melted, the brown ground and the first green shoots came out. Sheriff Thornton planned another trip to Hollow Creek. This time, he brought Florence with him so she could try to remember where she had been. The choice caused a lot of debate. Many people thought that making Florence think about that traumatic event could make her condition worse, but the sheriff said it could be both helpful and necessary for the investigation. Everyone was surprised when Florence said she would go. Maybe some part of her had to go back and face what had happened during those weeks she had been away. 8 people left for Hollow Creek in the morning of April 1900. Along with Florence and Sheriff Thornton, there was Dr. Hayes, 2 deputies, Samuel Curtis, an experienced tracker, and Martha, who insisted on going with her sister. The trip took a long time. As they got closer to the area, Florence got more and more scared. She was shaking her hands and breathing hard. She asked over and over to stop, saying she. I couldn't go on. Martha held her hand and told her nice things. Dr. Hayes kept an eye on Florence's health and was ready to stop everything if she passed out. Florence stopped dead when they finally got to the start of Hollow Creek. Her face was as pale as freshly melted snow. She pointed down the valley with a trembling hand and said she recognized the place. This was the start. From there, her memories became fragmented, but she could feel something, a kind of visceral recognition that went beyond conscious. Memory. The group advanced cautiously with Florence hesitantly giving directions. They walked for over 2 hours through the valley. The vegetation was different in spring, greener, denser. Birds sang in the trees, something they didn't hear in winter. The stream ran stronger, fed by meltwater from the mountains. Florence led them along a winding path, climbing steep slopes, skirting rock formations. At one point, she stopped in front of a stone wall covered in moss and ivy. There, she said, the cave was there. The men approached and began to push aside the vegetation. Sure enough, there was a narrow opening in the rock, almost invisible if they didn't know where to look. The entrance was low, forcing them to stoop to pass. Samuel Curtis, the tracker, entered first with a lit flashlight. After a few moments, his voice echoed from inside, calling to the others. There was something inside they needed to see. The cave opened into a larger chamber a few meters inward. The ceiling was natural, formed by erosion. Over thousands of years, but the floor was clearly human-made. Circles had been drawn with carefully arranged white stones. In the center were the remains of an ancient fire, and all around disturbing objects. Small dolls made of twigs tied with plant fibers. More medallions like the one found in the clearing hanging from rusty chains and bones not human apparently from small animals arranged in specific patterns. Florence refused to enter the cave. She stood outside with Martha shaking uncontrollably. She said this was the place. She was sure of it. She had been missing for part of her time there. Memories came back in painful flashes. She remembered the cold, the smoke from the fire, voices whispering around her. But the faces remained obscured, as if her mind refused to reveal them completely. Sheriff Thornton examined everything methodically. He collected some of the objects as evidence. He noticed inscriptions on the cave walls scratched into the stone with some sharp tool. They were the same signs that were on the medallion. Some of them looked very old. Time has worn it down. Some were made more recently, and the marks on the rock were still easy to see. This proved that people had been using the area for a very long time, maybe even generations. It wasn't a one-time thing. It was a planned, organized pattern that happened over decades or even centuries. A very upsetting discovery was made by one of the deputies. In the corner of the cave, he found a piece of fabric buried under a thin layer of dirt and rocks. Part of a dress that was worn down and stained. The style and color go together. Lists of clothes that people wore many years ago. It might have been Elizabeth Thorne's or one of the other women who have gone missing over the years. The fabric was wrapped carefully and put away as proof. There were lots of notes that Dr. Hayes took on everything. He made maps of the cave, copied the writing on the walls, and made a list of everything he found. He was sure they were looking at proof of a secret cult that had been meeting in these mountains for a very long time. Who were these people, though? How were they? Put together? Why did they pick out certain young women? What's more, were they still doing things? After coming out of the cave, the group did one last search of the area. A man named Samuel Curtis found Florence's notebook tucked away in the roots of an old tree. The small leather book was hurt by water. Some pages were stuck together and couldn't be read, but others could still be. The sheriff gave it to Florence carefully and asked her if she remembered what she had written. Florence took a look at the book, as if it were something cursed. She grabbed it with shaking hands and started to turn the pages. The first ones were written before they disappeared. Florence had, in fact, been looking into the old cases of people going missing. She had made connections between times, places, and the ages of the victims. Her notes were giving her ideas for a theory. The young women were picked based on a pattern that had to do with the moon and the way the mountains were shaped. Florence found out that in years that were multiples of 16, people went missing during the October new moon. When Elizabeth Thorne went missing in 1867, it was 32 years before 1899. In 15 years, in 1915, the next cycle would begin. The notes did have something else, though. Florence wrote that she had gotten a letter from someone who didn't want to be named, but knew about her investigations and wanted to meet her. Hollow Creek is where the meeting will take place. The last entries that made sense ended with Florence on the night before she went missing, deciding to go to the meeting because they were too interested to say no. The next pages of the notebook were a disturbing mess. Florence's handwriting, which was usually neat and easy to read, became less consistent. Some words were so big they took up whole pages, while others were so small it was almost impossible to read them. They weren't full sentences. They were just parts of thoughts. It looked like her mind was falling apart as she wrote. There were pictures of the signs they knew, but there were also faces that were skewed, eyes that filled whole pages, and hands that looked like they were coming out of the paper. To Dr. Hayes's attention, one page stood out. Florence wrote the same sentence over and over, dozens of times, until it filled up the whole page. They always keep an eye out from behind. There was no background or explanation, just that sentence over and over again. With each line, the pen used more force, until it tore the paper in some places. The doctor saw the warning signs of deeply rooted mental disturbance that might have been caused by drugs or severe mental trauma. Sheriff Thornton had an idea of what might have happened. Florence had accidentally caught the attention of people who didn't want to be found while she was looking into historical disappearances on her own. The letter from someone else was a trick. Members of this secret cult grabbed her when she went to the meeting at Hollow Creek as planned. They held her captive in some way, maybe in the cave or somewhere else, putting her through rituals that involved denying her senses, using hallucinogens derived from local plants, and intensely manipulating her mind. But there was something wrong with this idea. How did Florence get away if she was being held prisoner? Why did the people who held her live? Except for Elizabeth Thorne, who came back and died a few years later in a suspicious way, none of the other women who went missing were ever seen again. Florence was different. There was a problem with her captor's plan, or she had some inner strength that helped her fight back and get away. The sheriff set up systematic searches all over the Hollow Creek area over the next few days. They looked for other caves, any signs of recent human activity, and secret paths that might show that people moved around a lot. They found 2 more caves with writing on the walls, but neither of them looked like it had been used recently. It looked like the people who were responsible for Florence's escape had left the area completely, going away into the mountains. The investigation also looked into the people in the area. Sheriff Thornton started to ask people in a quiet way to try to figure out who might be involved, but it was very hard to get information in a place where families had lived alone for generations, where secrets were kept secret, and where outsiders were seen with suspicion. When the subject came up, people shut down. Some said they had no idea. Some people just wouldn't talk. But there was one important exception. Agnes Pritchard, an old woman who lived alone in a rundown cabin on the higher slopes, went up to the sheriff on her own. Agnes was 83 years old and was seen as a strange person in the area who talked about prophecies and new herbs that could heal. Many people thought she was just an old woman who was lost, but she loved the stories her grandmother had told her about the first people who came to live in these mountains. Agnes sat in the makeshift sheriff's office and spoke in a voice that was shaking but determined. She said that what Florence went through was not new. Her grandmother told her about a group that had been around before the United States became independent, maybe even before the first European settlers came in the 1600s. They held on to old beliefs and practices that they had brought from Europe and mixed a skewed version of Christianity with old pagan beliefs. The people thought that mountains were holy and had doors that led to other worlds. Agnes said that this group did certain rituals every 16 years, always during the new year. October moon. They picked young women who seemed especially sensitive, like they had a link to the spiritual world. The women in this group were seen as carrying what they called an inner light. The ritual was supposed to move this light, but Agnes wasn't sure what that meant. A lot of those who were picked never came back. The few people who were able to get away were permanently scarred, and the experience messed up their minds. The sheriff listened to everything with doubt, but also with more and more interest. Worry. Anything Agnes said she couldn't back up. These were oral stories that had been told for generations. They were full of superstitions and had probably become skewed over time, but there were parts that fit exactly with what they had found. It happened every 16 years, and certain young women were chosen through rituals and cycles. Agnes was talking about the exact pattern that Florence had found in her research. The old woman shook her head sad when the sheriff asked her if she knew who was in this group today. She said, "They were ghosts or shadows that moved around among normal people without revealing who they were. During the day, they might be good farmers, but at night, they might be cultists. They had 2 separate lives and kept each other safe by following a strict code of silence. Anyone who tried to make them known was in great danger. It seems that Agnes's grandmother died in a suspicious way after talking too much about the death." Before she left, Agnes gave one last warning. It was said that Florence was in danger. The fact that she got away and lived was an insult to the group. They could try again, or even worse, they could find another way to punish her. The woman told the family that they should really think about leaving the area and starting a new life far away from the cult. The sheriff said he would take her advice to heart and increase patrols of the Whitaker property. Yet there was a problem in the real world. The Whitaker family didn't have the money or tools to just leave their land and start over somewhere else. They only had the small farm, owned and passed down from generation to generation. If you left, you'd probably be poor and have to start over, with no guarantee of safety or success. For fear of superstitions and secret cults, Florence's proud father would not leave the land where he had lived and worked all his life. Watauga County had a tense calm over the next few months. Long, warm days came with the summer of 1900, which was very different from the dark winter that had seen all the bad things happen. Florence was slowly getting better. Even though her wounds had healed, there were still some marks on her body that would always remind her of what happened. She started doing chores around the house again, taking care of the garden, and eating with the family more often. But people who knew Florence well knew that she had never really come back. Her eyes looked far away, like a part of her was still lost in those mountains. She didn't smile very often. She didn't say much. She didn't say anything about what had happened. When someone tried to bring it up, she just pulled away. She closed in on herself like an oyster does to protect its painful pearl. Martha was the one person she always spent time with. The sisters would spend hours together, sometimes just being with each other without talking. Martha saw that Florence had picked up some strange new habits. She wouldn't let the candles go out in her room at night, even though it was hot outside. She told them she couldn't sleep in the dark. She also started drawing little things on scraps of paper, and the pictures were always the same symbols. She found it in the cave. When asked, Florence said that drawing helped her relax, but she couldn't quite say why. Dr. Hayes kept coming to see Florence on a regular basis to check on both her physical and mental health. In order to get advice on how to treat what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, he regularly wrote to colleagues in bigger cities. At the turn of the century, doctors didn't have that term, but they did have. Understand what deep psychological trauma is. All Hayes could do was offer herbal tinctures that would help calm the person down and suggest a calm place to be and a regular schedule. Things took a surprising turn in August of that year, which shed new light on the case. A traveling salesman named Thomas Garrett was in the area and heard about Florence's story at a local pub. He went to Sheriff Thornton and gave him information that he thought was important. Garrett sold goods all over the Appalachian Mountains on a long journey, and collecting stories. He had heard similar stories in other mountainous parts of Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky while he was traveling. Garrett wrote these stories down in a small notebook that he brought with him. At least 8 cases of young women going missing in the mountains under strange circumstances have been reported. During the month of October, all of them came back weeks later with broken memories and deep trauma. People were getting sick in many states, but they were always in remote mountain areas. Garrett thought he was seeing a bigger pattern that went all the way across the Appalachians, not just in North Carolina. The sheriff was very upset by this information. If Garrett was right, they weren't dealing with a single group. Instead, they might have been dealing with a large network that worked in several states. Not only was the problem much bigger than anyone thought, but it also made it very hard to investigate. How could they fight something that was so common and well hidden in how big the mountains are? Garrett put forward his own idea. He thought that these groups were leftover members of secret societies in Europe that had been persecuted in their home countries hundreds of years ago. When they came to the Americas, they lived in the most remote areas so that no one would get in the way of practicing their religion. Over many generations, these practices mixed with parts of the beliefs of the local indigenous people, making something new and hard to track down. They were kind of like a secret religion. The outside world can't see it. Sheriff Thornton carefully wrote down everything and sent reports to the state police, but they didn't give him a good response. The Raleigh government had more important things to do. The country was quickly becoming more industrialized and modernized. It seemed like stories about hidden mountain cults were from a different time. There were superstitions in rural areas that didn't need any official investigation. The sheriff was essentially left alone to handle the case. At the same time, Florence created an interest we didn't expect. She started looking for books about the Cherokee people who lived in the area before the first European settlers were forced to leave. She read for hours by candlelight and made notes in the pages. She told Martha that she needed to understand when she was asked what she was looking for. How these people came to believe what they did and who they were all things she needed to know. It was as if she could deal with her trauma better by understanding. Martha was scared that Florence was getting involved in something risky again. Still, Dr. Hayes had a different point of view. He thought Florence's intellectual interest meant she was trying to take back control of her story. Instead of just sitting back and taking it, she wanted to study and research her own experience. Hayes supported this method because he thought it might help people. Florence learned a lot of interesting things from what she read. She discovered that some groups of Scottish and Irish people talked about rituals, settlers in the 18th century who moved to the Appalachians. These groups brought with them old customs, some of which go back to Europe before Christianity. People talked about lunar cults, fertility rituals, and the idea that portals between worlds opened in certain places on certain dates. The pattern she had seen before she disappeared was there in every way. Florence did find something darker, though. There were historical records, albeit fragmentary, of human sacrifices. Some of these groups played in the old European lands. Ancient people gave chosen young women to the gods in exchange for good harvests, health protection, or spiritual knowledge. The church and the government had harshly banned these practices, sending people who did them into hiding or exile. Could these rituals somehow carry on in the mountains of the United States, with some changes but mostly the same? During one of his visits in early fall, Florence told Sheriff Thornton what she had found. She had planned her research methodically, putting together different historical sources. She did a great job with her investigation, which made the sheriff both impressed and worried. If Florence was right about what she thought, then the people who caught her were following very old and deeply rooted traditions. It wasn't something that could be taken apart with a few arrests. The sheriff chose to do something dangerous. He started to mix in with local social circles by going to community events, harvest festivals, and religious gatherings. He watched people's actions to see if there were any signs that they were talking to each other behind their backs. He kept track of who went missing on certain nights, who had family ties to the area for a long time, and who seemed to know a lot about the mountains and their secrets. He had to work slowly and frustratingly, but over time he started to notice some strange patterns. There was a group of families who always got together at the same remote properties on certain dates. It wasn't these. They weren't like normal religious gatherings because Reverend Blackwood or any other well-known religious figure wasn't there. They were private, quiet events that not many people talked about in public. There were at least 5 main families that the sheriff could see that seemed to be at the center of these groups: the Frasers, the Mlouds, the Morrisons, and the Caldwells. All of them were Scottish families that had lived in the area for more than 100 years. Back in September 1900, the sheriff got useful information from a source you wouldn't expect it. A young member of the Caldwell family named James approached him in secret. James had trouble with his faith when he was only 22 years old. He was born into this secret tradition and had been a part of rituals since he was a child. But as he got older and learned more about the world, he started to doubt what his family and the group did. James told everyone that the group was called the Guardians of the Mountains. They thought they were guardians of ancient knowledge, keepers of wisdom that goes back to the beginning of time. People didn't think of the rituals they did as bad. Instead, they saw them as necessary to keep the spiritual and material worlds in balance. Some people thought that the chosen young women could help bring this balance back. From their point of view, it wasn't about needless violence. It was about a holy purpose. James did say, though, that not even the people who took part in the rituals fully understood everything that happened. There were lies. Secrets were layers of information that only the oldest people in the group knew. He had never done one of the full 16-year rituals because he was still too young. But he had heard stories being whispered and bits of conversations between the older people. He was sure that there was something deep and scary going on at Hollow Creek and other holy places in the mountains on those special nights. When the sheriff asked James directly about Florence, he looked uncomfortable. He said that her choice had been made by the elders of the group when they found out she was looking into past disappearances. This was seen as a sign, an indication that she possessed the special sensitivity they sought. The leaders told the person who sent the anonymous letter to do it. The plan was to get her to come in, do rituals to get her ready, and then do the whole ceremony during the October new moon. But something went wrong. Florence fought back in a way they had never seen before, even though they were giving her drugs and she was surrounded by intense manipulation of the mind. She couldn't give up completely because of something inside her. When everyone was in the cave the night of the main ceremony, Florence had some kind of violent breakdown. She screamed, fought, and tore her own clothes. The group didn't agree on what to do. Some people wanted to go on. Some people thought she was controlled by something they couldn't see or touch. During the chaos that followed, while the other people in the group argued vehemently, Florence was able to get away into the forest. These people tried to follow her, but it was too dark and rough to do so. Then there was fear. They let her go because they were afraid that something bad had happened and that forces they didn't fully understand had risen. They thought she would die in the cold or get lost in the mountains forever. People thought it was very bad that she lived and came back. James said that the group went into a period of silence and thought after what happened with Florence. A lot of people were scared, unsure if they should keep doing what they were doing. Others were very angry and blamed the younger members for not being careful enough. In the group, there was a split. Some families chose to stop doing the old things altogether. Others stayed committed, but they hid things and were even more careful. In 1915, the next full ritual was set to happen, and there was a lot of disagreement about whether it should happen or not. In a formal setting, like court, the sheriff asked James if he would be willing to talk about what. He knew. After being quiet for a while, James spoke up. His words showed that he was scared to do what was right. Not just afraid of the group's anger, though that was a real fear. They were also afraid of what would happen if all the secrets were revealed. He said that there were things in the mountains that the group had learned to keep inside or at least be aware of. Anyone could have bad things happen if the whole building was suddenly destroyed. The sheriff was angry about this answer. However, he also got it. James didn't really belong in either of the two worlds he was in. Thornton told the boy that his identity would be kept secret and that he would not tell anyone about the information. Of course, he also made it clear that he would have to do something. He couldn't just forget what he had learned. Poor people were in danger. Florence had made it through, but how many others had been so lucky over the years? The sheriff talked with Dr. Hayes and Florence over the next few days about what they should do next. Florence's answer surprised both of them. At least, not yet. She didn't want to face the group directly. She thought they needed more time and more proof to fully understand what they were up against. If you act too quickly, the group could disappear even further into the shadows, making them even more dangerous. Florence had her own plan too, but she wouldn't tell anyone the whole thing. Florence suggested something that the sheriff and Dr. Hayes thought was crazy at first. She, not only for her own case, but for every historical disappearance she could find, she wanted to write down everything and make a full record that would last. She wanted to talk to older people like Agnes Pritchard to get their stories before they died and took their knowledge with them. She thought that they could only find a good way to stop this phenomenon if they fully understood its scope and history. Dr. Hayes thought this approach was a good one. As a scientist, he valued organized records. He offered to help Florence by giving her materials and advice on how to do things. Sheriff Thornton was less sure about this work because he thought it might put Florence in danger again. But she was determined, and after what she went through, she was stronger than she had been before. It was like going through the worst had shown her a bravery she didn't know she had. What followed were a few months of Florence working very hard on her project. She went around the area, always with Martha or her. Father going to remote farms and talking to the older people who lived there. At first, many people didn't want to speak up, but Florence was very good at getting people to trust her. It wasn't an accusation. She didn't judge. She didn't say anything. Over time, people started telling stories they had kept secret for decades. This story was told by Rebecca Stone, who is 70 years old. Her sister went missing in 1851 and was never found. Henry Blackburn, another old man, said that his mother had been picked in 1835 but died. While the ritual was going on, for reasons that the family never fully understood, after story came out, they all fit together in a scary pattern that went back over 150 years, maybe even to the first people who lived in the area. Florence compiled everything into several new notebooks, creating a detailed chronology. She found at least 23 cases of young women going missing or being killed in mysterious ways, all of which happened in October and followed the 16-year cycle. There were also cases that weren't as clear-cut and didn't follow the exact pattern, but they seemed to be linked. Florence's work was turning into a historical record of a dark part of life in the Appalachians that had never been seen before. At the same time, fall of 1900 went on. As October came around again, it brought back painful memories for Florence and her family. On the 17th, it would have been a year since she went missing. Florence was determined to do something important that day. She chose to go back to Hollow Creek, not to relive the terrible event, but to face it head-on. She wanted to go back to the exact spot where her trouble began, this time fully conscious and in control. Sheriff Thornton tried to talk her out of it, saying it was dangerous and pointless. Florence wouldn't give up. In order to show that she was no longer scared, she said she had to do this for herself. Martha agreed with her sister's choice and offered to go with her. After giving it some thought, Dr. Hayes also agreed, realizing that facing the trauma site directly could be helpful for healing. A bunch of 8 would be put together for the trip to make sure safety. Florence came back to Hollow Creek on October 17, 1900, exactly 1 year after she had gone missing. A lot of people said the day was clear. The deep blue sky that you see in the mountains in the fall. There were bright shades of gold, red, and orange on the leaves of the trees. The landscape was beautiful, which was very different from the bad memories Florence had of that place. When they got to the valley's start, Florence asked to be left alone for a moment. Martha was unsure, but Florence said she was going to be okay. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and walked a few steps ahead of the others. She breathed in the cool fall air. The stream, the wind in the trees, and the sound of a bird singing were all sounds she could hear. For a moment, she let herself just be there, without fear or worry, just existing in the present. Florence then opened her eyes and kept walking. The group kept quiet as they followed her. They went back to the same place they had been months before. Secret Cave. Florence walked right in this time without any hesitation. The cave was quiet and empty. The ritual items that were left behind had been taken away by someone. The only thing that was left were the symbols on the walls, which were silent reminders of old practices. Florence stood in the middle of the cave and looked around for a long time. Then she reached into her bag and took out one of the notebooks where she had written down her research. She began to read out loud the names of all the women who had been hurt over the years. Hi, Elizabeth. Many others, like Thorne, Sarah Mackenzie, Catherine Fraser, Margaret Dunar, and many more. Even though they couldn't speak, Florence was determined that they would not be forgotten. Each name that was said was a way to remember and honor their lives. Florence put the notebook down on the floor and took something else out of her bag when she was done reading the names. Her care was shown as she lit the small candle. The weak flame flickered in the cave's dim light, but it stayed lit. Florence left it exactly where she found it, center where the ceremonies took place. It was her own ritual, a way for her to turn that scary place into a memorial, a place to remember instead of be scared. As they left the cave, everyone was very quiet. She looked different as they walked back through Hollow Creek. Her step was lighter than it had been in months. Martha saw that her sister was crying quietly, but the tears weren't from pain. They were tears of freedom, of finally working through something deep. Let go. Florence seemed to be really starting to get better for the first time since she got back. In the months that followed, Florence kept up her work as a documentarian with new energy. She did more than that, though. She started teaching young women in the area about the risks of going into the mountains by yourself and how to spot lies and threats. It was still too hard for her to talk about her own experience directly, so she used stories and examples to teach important lessons. Mothers in the community began to seek her out, asking her to talk to their daughters. Reverend Blackwood, who was skeptical of Florence's work at first, ended up openly supporting it. He knew that the official church missed some parts of the community's spiritual life, like shadows where old habits still lived on. He started giving sermons about how important it was to bring light to dark places and face evil instead of ignoring it. Some older people in the congregation didn't feel comfortable with this approach, but a lot of young people liked it. While this was going on, Sheriff Thornton kept a quiet eye on the families that James Caldwell had told him were part of the secret group. He didn't have enough proof to officially arrest them, but the fact that they were always there made their presence known. Someone was watching them. Some people in these families started to leave the area, sell their land, and move to other parts of the country. Some people stayed, but their secret meeting ended completely at least in Watauga County. There were big changes in the spring of 1911. Thomas Garrett, the traveling merchant who had brought news of similar cases happening in other parts of the country, came back to the county. This time, he had interesting news. He had talked to police in several states and reporters who were interested in the story. People outside of North Carolina were starting to pay attention to Florence's case. More and more people wanted to know about secret societies and occult practices that were going on in the background of American life. In April of that year, a reporter from Richmond, Virginia named Alexander Pembroke came to Watauga County to talk to Florence and write down her story. At first, Florence wasn't sure because she was afraid of being found out, but Dr. Hayes pushed her and said that telling her story could protect her. People who want to silence her would have a much harder time and be more likely to get hurt if she were a well-known person. Florence said she would talk to Pembroke, but only under certain conditions. Specifics. She wouldn't let her story be sped up or used for cheap entertainment. She wanted the attention to be on the other victims and on bigger issues of history and society. Yes, Pembroke agreed. He spent 2 weeks in the area interviewing Florence, Sheriff Thornton, Dr. Hayes, Agnes Pritchard, and other people because he was impressed by how smart and determined the young woman was. The 3-page article that came out of it was printed in the Richmond Times in June 1901. They were very careful. A well-researched piece of journalism that looked into the history of a people going missing in the Appalachian Mountains, the secret traditions that European settlers brought with them, and Florence Whitaker's case in particular. Pembroke was able to find a balance between sensitivity and impact, making something that was both moving and informative. The publication had effects that were not expected. Other women from different parts of Appalachia started getting in touch with us. Some wrote to the newspaper. They also told stories of strange events and disappearances. They had heard about secret ceremonies going on in their own communities. It was becoming clear that the problem affected a lot more people than anyone thought. These weren't separate groups. They were part of a network that went across the mountains and connected hundreds of miles. There was also bad press about the article. Florence started getting letters from unknown people. Some were mean, and others tried to get her to stop talking about it. In one especially scary letter, it was said that she had woken up forces she didn't understand that getting in the way would have terrible results. Sheriff Thornton stepped up surveillance around the Whitaker property, but Florence wouldn't give in. She had a reason to live, and she wasn't going to give up. Something very strange took place in the summer of that year. An older woman named Ellelanina Mloud went out of her way to find Florence. She was from one of the families that the sheriff had identified as being part of the secret group. Ellelanina was 68 years old and clearly sick. She was coughing all the time, having a hard time breathing. She was tormented by moral questions because she knew she didn't have much time left to live. Ellelanina told Florence that she had been a part of the rituals all her adult life. Things that she would never forget were terrible things she had seen. The most important thing was that she had records. Her late husband was one of the guardians of the group's ancient texts, which were handwritten books that had been passed down through generations and explained where the practices, rituals, and beliefs came from. Names of every member over the years. Ellelanina wanted these papers to be kept safe, not to make the group look good, but as proof of what had happened in the past. With trembling hands, Florence took the papers. There were 3 thick books with worn leather bindings, their pages yellowed with age. Different authors wrote it over many decades, as shown by the different handwriting. There were entries from 1762, which is almost 140 years ago. The texts had diagrams and were written in English and Old Scottish Gaelic. There are pictures, signs, and descriptions of rituals that are so detailed that they would scare anyone today. Florence read the books that Ellelanina Mloud gave her over and over again for weeks. Each page showed more of a story that was both interesting and scary. The first written records talk about people who came to the Appalachians to escape religious persecution in Scotland. They brought beliefs that mixed early Christianity with much older Druidic practices that had been kept alive in secret in Scotland. Highlands for hundreds of years. As the story went on, these settlers found that some places in the mountains had what they called concentrated spiritual energy. One of these places was Hollow Creek, but there were others all over the area. They thought that there were weaker barriers between the physical and spiritual worlds at certain times of the lunar calendar, especially during the October new moon. They believed that the rituals they did let them talk to their ancestors and things they didn't fully understand. To them, the chosen young women were not sacrifices in the usual sense, but rather people who could help. The group thought that women with certain spiritual traits could help ancient wisdom flow through the world. But the records also showed something bad. The ritual had become shady over the years. What started out as a spiritual practice had become more dangerous as fanaticism and a growing loss of touch with reality took over. A lot of. The young women never made it through the process. The intense experience killed their minds and bodies. Florence found the names of all the victims from more than 100 years ago in the books, as well as specifics about each one, like what they looked like and when they went missing. There were also detailed notes about what had happened during the rituals. It was clear proof of crimes that happened over many generations. But it was also history, a record of how people shaped their beliefs and when. If left alone and unquestioned, it could turn into something horrible. Dr. Hayes and Sheriff Thornton went over the papers with Florence. They had to make an important choice. The books were not only enough proof to bring the other members of the group to justice, but they were also very important pieces of history. They finally decided to make careful copies of the texts after a long talk. The copies would be used for legal and schoolwork, while the originals would be kept safe. 2 years after Florence's death, in the fall of 1911. Sheriff Thornton finally had enough proof to do something about the disappearance. With the help of state police, he planned an operation that led to the arrest of 7 people who were thought to be leaders of the Guardians of the Mountains group. They were accused of plotting, kidnapping, and having a hand in the deaths of several young women over the years. After that, one of the most shocking trials in North Carolina history would happen. Florence was asked to give evidence. In that moment, things were very hard for her. Standing in court with some of the people who had planned her capture and traumatized her took a level of courage she didn't know she had. But when it was her turn to talk, she had a strong, clear voice. She talked not only about her own experience but also about all the other victims. This gave people who had never been able to speak out a chance to do so. The test went on for 3 weeks. 4 of the accused were found guilty and given long prison terms. 3 more were found not guilty because to a lack of direct proof of committing specific crimes. There wasn't perfect justice, even though it was clear they were part of the group. It was a start, though. More importantly, the case brought attention to the problem of secret societies working in remote areas and the need to protect communities that are weak across the country. Florence kept making documentaries for a few more years. She put together her historical research and accounts from survivors in a book called Shadows on the Mountains, which came out in 1905. The writing was controversial, but a lot of people read it. It got people talking about the hidden traditions that people in rural America keep and how modernity and isolation can be dangerous together. During everything, Martha stayed by her sister's side. In Watauga County, they became well-known people. Because they were brave and wanted to protect other young women, they opened a small school where they taught reading, writing, critical thinking, self-defense, and how to deal with psychological issues. Using tricks, it was their way of making sure that people in the future would be better able to spot and avoid hidden threats. Years went by. The Appalachian Mountains went through big changes in the 20th century. As time went on, roads were built, and even the most remote areas got electricity. This made it easier for people to do secret things, but it also made things less isolated. The Guardians of the Mountains group never fully recovered from being caught and being made public. Some of the remaining members gave up on their ancient. Some stopped practicing, while others just moved to another part of the country. She died in 1943 when she was 63 years old. She never got married because she spent her whole life doing the work she started after her ordeal. In her later years, she often went back to Hollow Creek, but this time she wasn't scared. Instead, she felt a sense of quiet reverence. It was a place that would always be a part of her life, but she had turned it from a sign of trauma into a sign of strength and purpose. Martha kept all of Florence's research and papers after she died. Death, giving them to the University of North Carolina Library in the end. Historians today study these archives to learn more about minority religious practices in rural America, gender and power issues in remote communities, and the amazing strength of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable hardship. The story of Florence Whitaker is still one of the most disturbing and interesting in Appalachian mountain history. It's important to remember that even in the most beautiful and peaceful places, there may be shadows. But she also shows us that having courage, being determined, and not being quiet can turn even the worst things that happen into things that make us stronger and better. Hollow Creek is still around, a peaceful gorge where the trees whisper in the wind and a cool stream flows over mossy rocks. Few visit the site, but those who know its history feel something when they are there. It is a place to remember the lives that were lost and the person who refused to let those lives end. Forget about it. Many things are hidden in the mountains, and some of them will never be fully revealed. But Florence's story makes sure that at least this dark part of the story will not be forgotten. If you were moved by this look into one of the scariest cases in U.S. history, you might want to subscribe to our channel to see more stories like this one that look into other dark mysteries from the past. Leave a like if this account piqued your curiosity about the secrets hidden deep within the mountains. Tell us in the comments what you think. What do you think about how old traditions can live on in remote areas and change people's lives in ways we can hardly imagine until we go back through history again?